In the 19th century, with the efforts of entrepreneurs such as Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, the United States rapidly rose to become an industrial superpower. At that time, the U.S. financial system was based on the principle of decentralization. Banks in each state were relatively independent and small in scale. The failure of one bank usually had little impact on others, and this system worked well at that time. However, as the economic sectors became more and more interconnected, the flaws in the financial system gradually emerged. In 1907, the United States encountered a severe financial panic, and banks collapsed like dominoes. This crisis made the U.S. government realize the need for a powerful institution to stabilize the financial order. Thus, the Federal Reserve came into being, entrusted with the important task of providing financial support when banks faced crises, becoming the lender of last resort. Subsequently, the gold standard became an important foundation of the U.S. financial system, stipulating that at least 40% of the U.S. dollars had to be backed by gold. This, to some extent, stabilized the money supply. But with the changes in the global economic pattern, the United States' status in the global economy continued to rise. In 1944, the Bretton Woods system was born. The U.S. dollar replaced the British pound as the world's reserve currency. Other countries' currencies were pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold. This system effectively made the Federal Reserve the central bank of the world. However, this system also had hidden contradictions. In order to stimulate employment, the Federal Reserve sometimes lowered interest rates and increased the money supply, which might lead to inflation, violating the original intention of stabilizing the currency in the Bretton Woods Agreement. In the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. economy seemed prosperous, with stable employment and a low inflation rate. But President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program and the Vietnam War led to a substantial increase in government spending. To maintain the operation of the economy and social projects, the Federal Reserve had to increase the money supply, which gradually eroded the credibility of the U.S. dollar, and inflation began to rise. In the following years, when facing the problem of inflation, Federal Reserve chairmen were under great political pressure. Bill Martin tried to control prices by raising interest rates but yielded to the pressure from President Lyndon Johnson. Arthur Burns also failed to resist the political pressure and could not effectively curb inflation. When G. William Miller served as the chairman, he was too worried that raising interest rates would trigger a short-term economic recession and was even more reluctant to take strong measures to control inflation. Eventually, he was ousted by the internal members of the Federal Reserve. By the end of the 1970s, the U.S. economy was in a severe crisis. The inflation rate reached 12%, the U.S. dollar depreciated significantly, and the economy was on the verge of collapse. Paul Volcker was born into a wealthy political family in New Jersey. His father, as a township manager, was excellent in government budget management, which had a profound impact on Volcker. Growing up during the Great Depression, he deeply experienced the pain brought by economic instability, thus developing a conservative concept of financial management. Volcker graduated from Princeton University with honors, and then obtained a master's degree in political economy from Harvard University. With these solid academic backgrounds, he quickly stood out in the financial field. He advanced from a financial economist at Chase Manhattan Bank to working in the Treasury Department during Nixon's administration, and became the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1975. In 1979, the U.S. economy was mired in high inflation, with the consumer price inflation rate exceeding 12%. In this critical moment, President Carter appointed Paul Volcker as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker was well aware that traditional monetary policies were no longer sufficient to address the current economic difficulties. He had to take bold and decisive measures. Volcker believed that inflation largely stemmed from people's expectations. Therefore, he announced an unprecedented policy, controlling the money supply instead of merely relying on raising interest rates. This policy might seem like a play on words at that time, but in fact, it was of great significance. It sent a strong signal to the market. The Federal Reserve was determined to control inflation firmly. However, the implementation of this policy was not smooth. The measures of raising interest rates and controlling the money supply had a huge impact on the U.S. economy in the short term. the borrowing costs of enterprises increased significantly. Many enterprises faced financial pressure and had to cut investment and production, resulting in a sharp rise in unemployment. Volcker became the target of criticism, and waves of opposition came from all sides. Even home builders sent him protest letters. The famous economist Milton Friedman also predicted that his policies would fail disastrously. During this difficult period, the U.S. economy fell into a full-blown recession, and President Carter lost the re-election to Ronald Reagan. But Volcker was not defeated by these pressures. He firmly believed that his policies were correct and must be persevered. Despite numerous difficulties, Paul Volcker always adhered to his policy propositions. In the first 3 years of his tenure as the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the inflation rate was successfully reduced by half, and it continued to decline in the following decade. His policies gradually achieved results, and the U.S. economy began to emerge from the crisis, entering an unprecedented period of prosperity. After inflation was effectively controlled, the economic credibility of the United States was restored. This laid a solid foundation for the United States to embrace the third industrial revolution and the information age. The confidence of enterprises and investors gradually recovered, economic vitality was released, and innovation and investment continued to increase, promoting the sustained growth of the U.S. economy. After successfully taming inflation, Paul Volcker chose not to seek a third term as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. His departure marked the end of an era. After him, the United States welcomed leaders with different styles and economic policies. However, his contributions to the U.S. economy are indelible. His policies not only solved the economic crisis faced by the United States at that time, but also created a favorable environment for the future economic development of the United States. Today, with the increasingly close connection of the global economy, looking back on Paul Volcker's experience, we can draw valuable lessons. His decisive decision-making in the face of complex economic situations and his firm belief under great pressure provide references for later economic policymakers. He taught us that on the road of economic development, sometimes painful but necessary measures are needed to achieve long-term stability and prosperity. Paul Volcker is undoubtedly a hero in the history of U.S. economic development.